Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today we are doing a Q&A for the Nova video. This is the pinned comment, and it's a pinned comment, it's a Q&A. Pinned comment means Q&A, and I'll be doing this alone, so please be patient with me because it's just me, all of my lonesome here, no Drakinifel here to mess up the audio. If you're wondering why I sound so good these days, that's why, because I'm not letting Drakinifel do the audio. Anyway. We'll get into it. So, in this particular video, I'm just going to be looking at the lore-related questions, and then we'll do the behind-the-scenes later, because there's a lot of lore questions, and I'd like to see a few more behind-the-scenes questions, and also, that's going to involve other people as well. So I need to give them time to prepare. So, without any further ado, we'll get into it. So, first question. From Fighting Falcon 77. Which doctrine for the Romulan military do you believe was most effective? Their 23rd century preference for birds of prey, precision, alpha, preemptive strikes, or their 24th century preference for heavy warbirds, intimidation, and force projection? Right. Let me think about that. So, what I would say is that obviously, the Empire is in two very different states when they're operating these doctrines. It's almost polar opposite. In the 23rd century, the Empire is pretty low and not really in the best of shape and not very confident in itself. By the 24th century, they are very, very confident in themselves and really do view themselves as an equal to the Federation. And bear in mind, they're basically the last man, other than the Federation. After the Dominion War, they are the last man standing. Until Hobus. But even then, after Hobus, it's like, okay, that was a setback, but it wasn't. It was far from the disaster, from the impression I get in STO, and granted, STO isn't canon, and STO isn't necessarily what actually happened, but the fact that their fleet is still very strong in the world of Star Trek Online suggests to me that the Warbird doctrine is more robust. It's better. It allows them far more flexibility. The Bird of Prey doctrine, or strategic strike, whatever you want to call it, it's a very much a one-trick kind of. It's a very much a one-trick pony. It's there to do a single thing and carry out that single mission. You know, when you're a hammer, everything is a nail, and it has a very limited number of ways you can use your fleet in that respect. Compared to in the 24th century, you can use your warbirds in all sorts of ways, as, of course, in power projection, and especially in that political realm, in diplomacy, in power projection, very significant, and that accounts for a lot. Really, in the early 24th century, that is the name of the game. It's only later in the 24th century, when you have the Dominion War, that it's time to butt heads. And if I think, if there was a big war, compare the role of the Romulan fleet in the Dominion War to how it might have featured in a potential, let's say, mass war in the 23rd century between the Klingons, Federation, and Romulans. And yeah, like the Romulans play an incredibly decisive role in the Dominion War, whereas in the 23rd century, they're kind of just picking up the pieces and, trying to get scraps, basically, from the Klingons' table, really. So, definitely I would say that the Romulan doctrine in the 24th century worked much better for them, and that's kind of why they stuck to it. Once they got the taste of warbirds, once they got into that whole idea of warbirds and had the ability to build them, they never really looked back. It's not like the Klingons, who kind of flip and flop between between battle cruisers or birds of prey. The Romulans are very much, and there's almost an internal tension with the Klingons there. Whereas the Romulans, once they started to get a taste of big capital ships like the Nova, they didn't look back, really. Okay. Next question from Geekius Maximus. Are you planning on doing any future ship chats for any Stormbirds that succeeded the Nova, like the Danos or maybe even the Raven? So I know the Danos, that's from Star Trek Online. quite possibly. And then the Raven, that's going to be a no. I'm not... so looking at the Raven from Klingon Academy, that's a hard no. That is not a successor to the Nova. That is somebody fucking around with a D7. That is probably one of the... As I say in the Nova video, and the D7 video at this point, they went crazy experimenting with these things, and something like that is probably the result. No, I won't. I won't be featuring the Raven. The Daenos, quite possibly, but there are also other candidates. But I will be filling in that sort of that lost era. But the Nova does stick around. Okay, then a similar question from Chris, son of Pear. Will I be covering anything from, like, Klingon Academy, like, again, Romulan designs from that game? So I can tell you, depending on when this video comes out, I can tell you that I'll be using the Firehawk. I really like the Firehawk. That's a very nice ship. It fits well with the Nova, and also kind of like that kind of period. It's about the right size. It's a good size battlecruiser. I'm not going to be using the, what is it? The Royal Hawk. The Imperial Hawk. The Imperial Hawk. Now, as I've been talking to him, he's one of the guys who worked on the Nova. Star Fox is working on a revamp, a remake of the Imperial Hawk, in a very similar vein to what we did with the Nova. And I would say it's a substantial improvement on the original design. The original design is quite an acquired taste, and you know he's bringing it up, updating it. But for me, the stuff like the Imperial Hawk and similar Klingon ships in that game go a little bit too far for my taste. Remember, like, this is only meant to be sort of the 2290s. This is still the 23rd century fundamentally. You shouldn't be building these massive 600-meter long battleships as appear in that game. So, yeah, that's really my thoughts on Klingon Academy. I love the cutscenes, by the way. That's great. If you haven't watched the cutscenes of Klingon Academy, look them up on YouTube. They're great. We should have gotten so much more of General Chang. So, this is from Oculcatum Questo. What UFP or Klingon ships beside Excelsior would most closely match the Nova? Okay, that's a difficult one. Aside from Excelsior, Klingon ships, I'm just thinking something that has hefty chunks of firepower. You've got L-39s, which are like a quad-engine, basically pursuit battlecruiser, but that would be outdone by Excelsior, so I wouldn't fancy its chances against the Nova. It could, and it would stand a lot better chance than, say, just a Katinga, but yeah, no. That's the thing. Because the Nova has this overwhelming frontal firepower, you really can't take it on at close range or in a head-on exchange. You're going to have to keep moving. You're going to have to use mobility. That's the one thing you can have over the Nova, is that you're probably faster. So probably, yeah, for Klingon's L-39, I was contemplating D-10, but D-10 is way too, like... D-10 is just a dumb battering ram of a ship, and that's not going to work against Nova. Then for the Federation, I would probably say... I'd probably say Andor 2. The Excelsior version of the Andor, basically. It has enough torpedoes to match the Nova. It's got Excelsior parts, so we can assume relatively similar speeds. Probably a little slower, but as long as it keeps range effectively, it could handle a Nova, but it would probably need support, because Nova would just cloak, sneak up, close range, plasma torpedoes, bang. So, yeah, and it doesn't quite have the mobility of Excelsior, but that's probably the next best candidate. Again, I wouldn't say something like Giorgio, because that's, again, a very head-on, aggressive ship, and if you try meeting fire with the Nova, you're gonna die. So, yeah, that would be my answer to that. He then asked a second question. Do I think... So, and this is actually a question that was kind of asked by a couple of people. Were Novas used in the Dominion War, so on and so forth, or were they used after Hobus? So I'm just going to kind of bracket this under all these questions as one question, because other people have asked this as well. So in the Dominion War, the Nova has a real problem in being used, and that is it is too small to be a capital ship or a warbird, and it is too big to be an effective escort. So it's just stuck in the middle. It's an antimatter driven ship, that is the way of things. But because it's too big, and you might say, oh, well, so are the White Winds, so are the Winged Defenders. Yes, but because those are smaller, they can clamp onto a Dideridex, onto the docking elements of the Dideridex, and the Dideridex can carry them with it. They can expend less fuel. You can't do that with the Nova. So unfortunately, it doesn't really have much it can do. You could maybe use it. I'd maybe use it for like internal supply lines, but also like bearing in mind, you might say, "Oh, use it as a transport or a siege ship." But the distances the Romulans have to cover are so big, and that's really where the Singularity Core comes into its own. And there's not really any point in just bringing this whole ship out just to have to create a logistics train specifically for it. So I don't think you'd really see Novas during the Dominion War. In terms of post-Hobus, absolutely. Like, the Romulans would just get anything out, given that they're willing to get an old Tallis out, and that's even older than the Nova, and has even more kind of demanding fuel, has an even greater fuel demand. Then, yeah, you could be a pretty ferocious warlord with some Novas equally. In a world where Diridexes and various other warbirds exist, you would probably do better to keep your head down. You'd probably do better to keep your head down if you had Novas. You can't throw your weight about like you could in the old days. So I think they might be about, but, they'll be keeping a low profile and will be very much in that support role for any fleets that they are part of. Next question is from Tom Clayton, and that's I should consider covering the geopolitical/economic elements in greater detail as part of these reviews, based on your headcanon and vessel superior. So he says, essentially, based on my headcanon, this vessel's superiority over comparative Klingon and Federation designs would embolden the Empire for war, so you should include the balancing factors that prevented this. Yes. I mean, and that's partially because this is an incomplete story, because this is effectively being told in 3 parts. Some more context will be lent in the Tomed incident, so on and so forth, as to specifically why. Essentially, what it comes down to the fact is, ultimately, Nova is produced in comparatively limited numbers. Yeah, there's about 20 of them, but there's a lot more Excelsiors by that point. There's quite a few Excelsiors by the time of the Tomed incident, and that only gets more so. And also, yes, the Romulans have Nova, but that's basically, in terms of large capital ships, that and Firehawk, that's about all they have. And the rest is birds of prey. Compare that to Starfleet, which has a lot of various different types of cruisers, especially in the sort of Lost era, Excelsior era, where you've still got carryover cruisers from the motion picture era. They've got a lot to play with, and the Romulans really don't. So that's largely why the Romulans don't have the numbers. Also, another reason that the Romulans don't precipitate a war is that they are very worried about the Klingons. And this is something that, I don't think I'm going to specifically cover, because it's a difficult thing to kind of explain. But effectively, with the Klingons in the Romulan-Klingon alliance, so it hits the rocks in 2271, and they're kind of sort of friendly, but they're like, it's complicated. That's their relationship status. It's complicated. And so what that means is, like, one side isn't even sure that if they do precipitate a war with the Federation, that the other is going to throw in. and in fact they might be concerned that the Earth will actually join with the Federation to, you know, pincer move them. You kind of have a kind of situation like you had with the sort of Cold War in the 70s, 70s, where you had rapprochement between US and China and détente, and it was almost pitting the Soviet Union and China against one another, sowing seeds of distrust. So that's kind of the situation you have in that period. The other element for the Romulans is that even, let's say the Klingons go to war. Let's say the Klingons start the war, and they can probably win on their own by like the 80s or 90s. Oh, of course, up until Praxis. But until then, they might even be able to beat the Federation. That being so, the Romulans still have very little incentive to help the Klingons. Because if they help the Klingons conquer the Federation, all they are doing is setting themselves up as the Klingons' next target. So, because of that, it actually makes more sense for the Romulans just to say, we're out. We're out, we're going to sit back and enjoy this, while these two pummel each other to pieces, and either we can sweep in afterwards, or we can play peacemaker, whatever. We will be better off for it. So, even though there's a lot of posturing around going to war and potentially allying with the Klingons, it's a lot of smoke and mirrors. It keeps them in, they're staying in the game without actually taking too much in the way of stakes. So, next question from James Ryan. With their enemies outnumbering them significantly and the Romulans' main strength being in smaller ships, and a few capital ships that were unable to win a protracted war, were the Romulans really a superpower, or are people in hiding behind their reputation and mysterious ways to survive? It's kind of partially covered by my previous answer, but like specifically, I suppose, for the 23rd century, initially, yeah, the Romulans in like the 60s are very much playing off the fact that no one has a clue about them. No one knows anything about them at all. As we move through the 70s and into the 80s and into the 90s, the image starts to clear up a lot more. Both the Romulans and the Federation get a better idea of what their actual capabilities are. They take a much more sober view of it. So, to an extent, yeah, they are initially hiding behind their reputation, and then it does become clear that they are kind of the tertiary power. They're still substantial, and they're probably like still edging out over nations like, for example, the Gorn or the Tholians. Nations like that. But I think, yeah, they are definitely playing third fiddle compared to the Federation and the Klingon Empire, which are the big military giants of the era, and they're just kind of dancing, you know, between the two of them. Okay, next question from Jacob Guevara. This is an interesting one. How many Novas would be needed to take down a Diduridex? Would it be cost effective on a pure attrition basis? A lot. A lot, Jacob. 4, if not more. Like, okay. And scale the Diduridex compared to the Nova. I don't think that there's enough Novas in the world to realistically beat the Diduridex. The Diduridex is like, if you're asking whether or not it was a cost-effective replacement, yes. Because the Diduridex is fuel efficient, and the Nova is not. That was one of the things about it. That's what made the Diduridex so revolutionary. Was it just gave them so much freedom. They could deploy their ships without a care in the world, basically, and that allotted them so much advantage. It's just not gonna happen. Yeah, looking at this scaling, it's just not gonna happen. You need a lot, and yeah, I don't think there's much merit in trying to work out how many Novas could be to Diduridex. I don't think 4 could do it. Maybe 6, but my point being, yeah, And that just goes to show the amount that Romulan technology advanced in the intervening years. I don't even think 6. I think you'd have to go for like 8. Really, just on the sheer basis of size being proportional to power. Yeah, I think you'd need 8 Novas probably. It really is. The Nova is, very good for the 23rd century, but again, going back to the Dominion War, by 24th century standards, it's out of its depth in a way that Excelsior really wasn't. So, yeah. Finally, question from Lice Finto, and that is, what kind of ships did the TOS Romulan fleet possess? So I covered it partially in the Romulan Doctrine 23rd Century Part 1, effectively. There are a few other ships I could mention. So you had the Thry, which is the ship from Star Trek Online. It's basically a Dideridex and a Tallis made a baby. And that's going to go out on long-range missions with basically a glassing beam and melt planets. Then you have the Tallis, that's short-range strike, take out enemy fortifications with the plasma torpedo. The Gallant Wing, that is there as a kind of an escort craft and also a defensive craft that's going to repel anyone who tries to come across the Romulan border. Other ships that exist are also the Star Glider. This is... I didn't really include it because it's interesting, it's a very nice ship, but it's basically useless in combat. The Star Glider is a lot like many of those jets built in the 50s and 60s, which were purely technological demonstrators. That was about it. Aside from that, it's not really got much going on. Another one is the Skyhawk, or the R4 Malheur class, or Muller class, which is basically an extended version of a Tallis. Looks a bit like a yacht, frankly, but that's a supply ship. That's a supply driver. But yeah, I mean, there's not much in the way of the Romulan fleet, because in this period, they're very much operating on having this very small, very professional fleet with very specialized ships. It's only later, as we move into the sort of movie era, that we see these more kind of multi-role, typical starships, like the Winged Defender, like the White Wind, like the Nova. So yeah, that's basically the Romulan fleet composition in the 23rd century, in the TOS era. As you can see, so it does undergo a real shift from this fleet that is very alien to what we kind of know from about the Romulans from TNG. They look, it looks very different. We go from that to something that is really starting to resemble, slowly but steadily, the fleet that we will see in Next Generation and Deep Space Nine. And with that concludes all the questions, or at least all the lore-related questions. So I'll see you guys next time for the behind the scenes. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video.